The cargo ship's hull groaned against the Atlantic waves, and Unteroffizier Klaus Bauer pressed his forehead against the cold metal railing. Around him, 200 German soldiers huddled in threadbare Afrika Korps uniforms, their skin still carrying the ghost of North African sun. They had surrendered 3 weeks ago in Tunisia, part of the 250,000 Axis troops who collapsed when Rommel's dream died in the desert. Klaus remembered the propaganda they had been fed. Surrender meant torture, starvation, execution. His brother Hans had written from the Eastern Front before disappearing. Tales of Soviet brutality that made Klaus's stomach turn. Now, crossing this gray ocean toward an unknown fate, he wondered if death would have been cleaner than whatever waited in Canada. The ship docked in Halifax on a cold October morning in 1943. Klaus braced himself for the mob, for the beatings, for the hatred. Instead, tired Canadian soldiers checked papers with bored efficiency. No clubs, no screaming, just procedure. A young private handed Klaus a sandwich, white bread, real meat, butter. Klaus stared at it like a riddle he couldn't solve. Behind him, 19-year-old Heinrich Vogel muttered the words they had all memorized. The enemy is savage. They will make us suffer. But the sandwich sat heavy in Klaus's hand, contradicting everything. The train journey north stretched 3 days through a landscape that defied belief. Klaus had fought across North Africa's desert, had seen the Mediterranean's blue waters, had known the tight villages of Bavaria where every tree was named and every field had an owner. This was different. The forest outside the train window went on forever, pine and spruce and birch rolling past in endless waves. No villages, no roads, no people, just wilderness that swallowed the horizon. An older prisoner, Wolfgang Richter, laughed bitterly. "They don't need to guard us," he said. "Where would we run? Into that." He gestured at the trees. That night, Klaus heard wolves howling in the distance, and the sound made every man in the car go silent. Camp 30 appeared on the 4th day, a compound of wooden barracks surrounded by wire fence near a place called Bowmanville in Ontario. But the fence seemed almost decorative compared to the forest pressing in from all sides. The camp commandant, Major Robertson, addressed them through an interpreter. They would receive 3 meals daily. They would have heated barracks. They could write letters home. They would be treated according to the Geneva Convention of 1929, which Klaus barely remembered from his teacher training before the war. Heinrich spat on the ground after the speech. "Lies," he hissed. "They're softening us for something worse." But the something worse never came. Days passed into weeks. The food arrived regularly. Not luxury, but sufficient. The barracks had stoves that actually worked. A Canadian guard named Sergeant James McLeod, a man with gray hair and tired eyes, supervised Klaus's work detail, repairing fence posts. McLeod was old enough to be Klaus's father, and he moved like someone whose bones remembered old wounds. One afternoon, McLeod noticed Klaus struggling with English instructions and sat down beside him. "You speak any English before the war?" he asked. Klaus shook his head. "I was a school teacher. I taught literature. Goethe, Schiller." McLeod nodded slowly. "I killed German boys at Vimy Ridge in 1917. Boys who probably read the same books." He stood up, brushed dirt from his uniform. "Let's try this again, slower this time." The first snow came in November, and with it a cold that Klaus had never imagined. -30°C. The guard said this was normal. They issued extra blankets without being asked, and Klaus lay awake in his bunk, trying to reconcile the enemy he had been taught to hate with the enemy who made sure he wouldn't freeze. Heinrich, in the bunk above, whispered constantly about tricks and deception. "They want us weak," he said. "They want us to forget who we are." But Klaus wondered if remembering who they were was precisely the problem. December brought the strangest moment yet. The guard erected a Christmas tree in the compound center. Some of the prisoners wept openly. Others sang Still Nacht, Silent Night, while Canadian soldiers stood outside in the snow, listening respectfully. Klaus received his first letter-writing privilege that night. He sat with blank paper for an hour, pen hovering uselessly. How could he explain this to his wife, Anna? How could he write that the enemy fed them, housed them, treated them like human beings? That a guard who had fought Germans in the last war now taught him English words? That he was more frightened by kindness than he had ever been by bullets. In the end, he wrote only, "I am alive. I am unharmed. I do not understand anything anymore, but I am safe. The world is not what we were told. I will write more when I find the words." He sealed the envelope, knowing the words might never come. Outside, the Canadian winter pressed down like a cold hand, and somewhere in the forest, wolves sang to the darkness. Klaus lay in his warm bunk, in his guarded camp, and felt more lost than he ever had in the Desert War. Because in war, you knew who to hate. In peace, even the peace of captivity, the rules vanished, and you had to decide for yourself what kind of man you were going to be. The snowstorm hit camp 33 days before Christmas, and Klaus Bauer watched through frosted windows as the world disappeared into white. He had seen snow in Bavaria, gentle flurries that dusted the village square and melted by afternoon. This was different. This was a wall of white that buried the compound under 2 meters of snow, temperature dropping to -35, wind howling like artillery fire. The guards issued extra blankets and doubled the coal rations for the stoves without waiting for requests. Heinrich Vogel stood in the corner of the barracks, arms crossed, face twisted in confusion. "It's a trick," he kept saying, but his voice carried less conviction each time. Major Robertson announced a work detail in January 1944, volunteers to help dig out a Canadian farm buried by the blizzard. Klaus raised his hand before he could think about why. 20 prisoners loaded onto trucks with Canadian guards, and they drove through a landscape so white and pristine it hurt to look at. The farm belonged to a man named William Carter, 60 years old with hands like tree roots. His wife Mary brought out thermoses of hot soup at midday. Klaus learned later that their son James had died at Dieppe in August 1942, cut down on the beaches by German machine gun fire. Mary Carter knew who they were, knew what uniforms they had worn, and still she served them soup with steady hands. When Klaus tried to thank her, she simply said, "You're cold. You're far from home. That's enough." He couldn't finish his soup. His throat had closed up with something he couldn't name. Back at camp, the prisoners organized a theater group. Major Robertson approved it, even provided lumber for a small stage. Klaus couldn't understand the logic. Why give prisoners tools and freedom? Why encourage them to create, to laugh, to be human? Wolfgang Richter, the cynical veteran who had seen 3 years of war before capture, explained it one night. "They're not keeping us prisoner. They're keeping us from killing each other. There's a difference." Klaus taught English classes in the evenings. Sergeant McLeod brought books from the town library, Shakespeare, Dickens, Mark Twain. Heinrich refused to attend. "You're collaborating," he accused Klaus. "You're forgetting Germany." But Klaus was beginning to think that remembering Germany meant remembering what it had become, and that was something he wasn't sure he wanted to carry anymore. February brought news from home. Klaus's father had died in an Allied bombing raid on Stuttgart. The letter was 2 months old by the time it reached him. Klaus read it 3 times, then walked to the fence line and stood in the snow until Sergeant McLeod found him. "I heard," McLeod said quietly. "I'm sorry." He didn't offer empty comfort or pretend war made death easier. He just stood there, another old man who had watched too many people die. After a while, McLeod said, "Major Robertson approved an hour's walk. Alone if you want. Just stay within sight of the camp." Klaus looked at him. "You trust me not to run?" McLeod's expression didn't change. "You won't run. Where would you go?" He was right. The forest offered freedom and death in equal measure. Klaus walked for exactly 1 hour, circling through deep snow. And when he returned, something inside him had shifted. He couldn't name it yet, but it felt like letting go. Heinrich's breaking point came in March. He convinced 2 other prisoners to attempt escape, believing the spring thaw would make the forest passable. They left at dawn, heading north toward what Heinrich imagined was civilization. The guards noticed by breakfast and organized a search party. They found the 3 prisoners 6 hours later, 3 kilometers from camp, half frozen and delirious. Heinrich's fingers were black with frostbite. The camp doctor, a Canadian military physician named Harris, worked for 2 hours to save them. Heinrich woke up in the infirmary with all his fingers intact, wrapped in bandages, surrounded by Canadian guards who had risked the cold to find him. He didn't thank them. He couldn't. His entire worldview was crumbling, and Klaus watched it happen like watching a building collapse in slow motion. One night in April, as the first thaw began, Sergeant McLeod sat with Klaus during a patrol. They smoked cigarettes in comfortable silence, watching the northern lights dance green and silver across the sky. Finally, Klaus asked the question that had haunted him all winter. "Why do you treat us like this?" McLeod was quiet for a long time. Then, "I was at Vimy Ridge in 1917. I watched my friends die in the mud. I killed German boys your age, younger even. I came home hating every German that ever lived." He flicked ash from his cigarette. "Then I got older. I realized hate is just another way to stay at war. And I was tired of war. So when they asked me to guard German prisoners, I figured I had a choice. I could keep fighting, or I could remember that before we were enemies, we were all just people." He looked at Klaus directly. "You're not my enemy anymore. The war made us enemies. But the war doesn't get to make all the rules." Klaus stood at the fence line the next morning, watching ice break up on a distant lake. Spring was coming. The war continued somewhere across the ocean. D-Day was months away, though they didn't know it yet. Germany was losing, but that news came slowly, filtered through propaganda and rumor. Klaus thought about his father's death, about Heinrich's frostbitten fingers, about Mary Carter serving soup to the men who might have killed her son. He thought about Sergeant McLeod's choice to remember humanity instead of hate. The wilderness surrounded them, indifferent and eternal, and Klaus realized that was what freedom actually meant. Not the absence of fences, but the space to choose who you became. The forest exploded into green, so vivid it seemed unreal. Klaus Bauer stood at the fence line in May 1944, watching a black bear amble past the compound with complete indifference to the 100 men watching from behind wire. A Canadian guard named Tommy, barely 18 years old, laughed and took a photograph. "She comes by every spring," he said in careful English. "We call her Maggie." Heinrich Vogel stared at the bear like it was an alien creature, which in a sense it was. Everything about this place defied the rules they had learned. But change was coming to Camp 30, and it wore a German naval uniform. Captain Ernst Mueller arrived in June, dragged from a sunken U-boat in the North Atlantic. He was a true believer, a naval officer who still clicked his heels and spoke of final victory even as Allied forces prepared to invade France. Mueller was 42, iron-hard, and utterly convinced that Germany would win despite all evidence. Within days, he had identified the loyal Nazis in camp and began organizing them. Heinrich, still nursing psychological wounds from his failed escape, gravitated to Mueller like a man drowning grabs driftwood. Klaus watched the camp divide itself. Those who wanted to survive versus those who wanted to keep fighting a war that was already lost. News of D-Day reached them on June 7th. The guards made no secret of it. Allied forces had landed in Normandy. The invasion had begun. Some prisoners wept with relief. Others sank into despair. Mueller stood in the barracks that night and spoke of secret weapons, of miracle victories, of Führer's genius. Klaus listened and felt nothing but exhaustion. He had been a schoolteacher before the war, had taught boys about Goethe and Schiller, about the beauty of language and thought. Now he was listening to a submarine captain promise victories that mathematics and reality made impossible. When Mueller finished his speech, Klaus simply said, "The war is ending. We need to decide who will be when it does." Mueller's eyes went cold. "You're a collaborator, Bauer. A traitor to Germany." Klaus met his gaze. "I'm a man trying to stay human. That's not the same thing." The camp expanded its work programs that summer. Prisoners volunteered for lumber camps and farm work, paid in camp currency that could buy small luxuries, cigarettes, chocolate, writing paper. Klaus worked alongside Canadian civilians, men too old or too young for military service, and learned their stories. An old farmer named John taught him how to identify tree species by their bark. A teenage boy named Peter, whose father was fighting in Italy, asked Klaus about Germany before the war. Klaus described Bavaria, the mountains, the festivals, the small-town life that seemed like it belonged to another universe. Peter listened with genuine interest, no hate in his eyes, and Klaus realized the boy saw him as a person first and an enemy second. It was terrifying how much that mattered. Wolfgang Richter received letters from a Canadian woman named Margaret who wanted to practice her German. They had never met, but their correspondence grew from language practice to something deeper. Wolf shared the letters with Klaus, his cynical face softening when he read her words. She asked about my life before the war, Wolf said. No one has asked me that in years. Not what I did in the war, who I was before it. Klaus understood. The war had made them into soldiers, into uniforms, into enemies. Margaret was asking Wolf to remember he was human. It was a gift more valuable than freedom. July brought a baseball game. Canadian guards challenged the prisoners to a match. Klaus had never played baseball, had barely heard of it. Sergeant McLeod spent a week teaching him the rules. Klaus hit a home run in the 5th inning, more from luck than skill, and the guards cheered as loud as the prisoners. Heinrich watched from the barracks window, refusing to participate in what he called mockery. But after the game, as Klaus walked past, Heinrich said quietly, "I don't know what we're doing anymore." It was the first honest thing Klaus had heard from him in months. August evening, Klaus sat outside carving wood, a skill taught by a guard who worked as a carpenter before the war. He was making a cardinal, a bird he had never seen in Germany but had learned to identify here. Heinrich approached and sat beside him without speaking. They watched the sun set over the forest, turning the trees gold and crimson. Finally, Heinrich asked, "What happens when the war ends?" Klaus didn't have an answer. None of them did. Germany was collapsing. The news came through official channels now. Paris liberated, Soviet armies pushing west, Allied bombers over Germany every day. They were winning the war against Germany while sitting in Canadian prison camps being treated like guests. The contradiction was so profound it made thought difficult. Maybe, Klaus said finally, still carving, we become the people we should have been before it started. Maybe we learn from this place. Heinrich looked at him. Learn what? Klaus thought about Sergeant McLeod, who chose mercy over revenge. About Mary Carter, who served soup to men who wore the same uniform as her son's killers. About the wilderness that surrounded them, offering both freedom and death, teaching them that nature didn't care about human wars. That kindness isn't weakness, Klaus said. That being human takes more courage than being a soldier. Heinrich didn't respond, but he didn't leave either. They sat together as darkness fell, and somewhere in the forest, wolves began their nightly song. The war continued across the ocean, but here in this strange camp, surrounded by endless trees and kind guards, Klaus felt something impossible growing. Hope that maybe, somehow, humanity could survive what humans had done to each other. Mueller watched them from across the compound, his face carved from stone, planning his next move. The camp was dividing, and summer couldn't last forever. But for this moment, in the long northern twilight, Klaus carved his wooden bird and believed that even broken men could learn to fly again. The radio crackled to life on May 8th, 1945, and every prisoner in Camp 30 gathered in the common room to hear the words that ended everything. Germany had surrendered. Hitler was dead. The war was over. Klaus Bauer stood among 200 men and heard nothing but silence. Some prisoners cried. Some stared at the floor. Heinrich Vogel sat with his head in his hands, shoulders shaking. Captain Mueller stood rigid in the corner, jaw clenched so tight Klaus could see the muscles jumping. Victory or defeat, the words felt meaningless. They had all lost something too large to measure. Then came the second announcement, and this one hit harder than surrender. Concentration camps had been liberated. The full scope of the Holocaust was being revealed. Millions dead in systematic genocide, industrialized murder on a scale that made battlefield death seem almost clean. Major Robertson read the reports aloud with steady voice, sparing them nothing. Dachau, Auschwitz, Bergen-Belsen. The numbers were impossible to absorb. Klaus felt his stomach turn. He had served in North Africa, had fought what he believed was a soldier's war against other soldiers. But this was something else entirely. Heinrich vomited in the corner. Even Mueller's face went pale, though he muttered about propaganda without conviction. Wolfgang Richter said what they all thought. We did this. Maybe not us personally, but we wore the uniform. We carried the flag. Repatriation was delayed. Germany was occupied, divided, destroyed. Where could they send prisoners when there were no homes to return to? Klaus received a letter from Anna, his wife, in July. She had survived the bombing of Stuttgart, was living in what remained of their apartment. Come home, she wrote. Whatever you've become, whoever you are now, come home. We'll figure out the rest together. He read the letter 30 times, memorizing every word. But there was another letter, too, from Sergeant McLeod's nephew. Tommy, the young guard who photographed bears and taught prisoners Canadian folk songs, had been killed in the final days of fighting in Holland. 19 years old, dead in a war that was already won. The prisoners held a memorial service. Wolfgang spoke in halting English about how Tommy had treated them like people. Mueller refused to attend. August brought decisions. Some prisoners applied to stay in Canada. Wolfgang was one of them. His pen pal Margaret had agreed to meet him, and they planned to marry. Germany is where I was born, Wolf told Klaus. But Canada is where I learned to be human again. I can't go back to being what I was. Klaus understood. The wilderness had changed them, and so had the kindness. Going back meant carrying that change into a broken country that might not want it. Heinrich made his decision too. He burned his Nazi party book in the evening, standing alone by the fence line while the pages curled into ash. Klaus found him afterward, staring at nothing. I was so sure, Heinrich whispered. I was so certain we were right about everything. Klaus had no comfort to offer except presence. They stood together as the sun set, two men who had believed lies and now had to live with that knowledge. September brought Mueller's reckoning. An investigation revealed his SS connections and participation in U-boat attacks on civilian vessels. He was transferred to face war crimes tribunals. As they loaded him onto the truck, he looked at Klaus and said, "You betrayed Germany, Bauer." Klaus shook his head. Germany betrayed itself. We just didn't want to see it. Mueller left still believing he was right, and Klaus realized that was the saddest part. Some men would never learn, would never change, would carry their hatred to the grave. The final day at Camp 30 arrived in October 1945, 2 years after Klaus had first seen the Canadian shore. The prisoners packed their few possessions, carved wooden birds, letters from home, books borrowed from Sergeant McLeod that they had been allowed to keep. Klaus stood at the fence line one last time, looking at the forest that had terrified and taught him. A deer walked past, completely unbothered by human drama. Sergeant McLeod approached, held out his hand. "You're a good man, Klaus. You always were. Don't let the war take that from you." They shook hands, old enemies who had become something like friends. "Thank you," Klaus said in English, his accent still thick but understandable. "For treating us like people. For showing us there was another way." McLeod nodded. Someone had to remember we're all human, even when we're enemies. Especially then. The train took them to Vancouver, where ships waited to cross the Pacific to Europe. Klaus saw the mountains, the ocean, the vast, indifferent beauty of a continent that had held them prisoner and set them free simultaneously. A guard pointed west. Japan is that way. They're rebuilding too. Everyone's rebuilding. Klaus thought about reconstruction, about the work ahead. Germany was rubble and shame. The world knew what had been done in Germany's name. Going home meant facing that, carrying it, somehow moving forward anyway. He stood on the ship's deck as they pulled away from Canadian shore, watching the land disappear into fog. The Atlantic stretched ahead, gray and endless. Klaus touched his pocket where the wooden cardinal rested, and a letter from McLeod. Remember, McLeod had written that even in war, some men chose mercy. Be one of those men in peace. The world needs builders now, not soldiers. It needs men who learn that kindness is strength. Klaus pulled out paper and began writing back. "Dear James," he started. "First names now. The war was over. I'm going home to rebuild. But I am taking the wilderness with me. Not the trees, but what it represents. The space to grow. The room to change. The silence that lets you hear who you really are." The ship moved through Atlantic fog, and Klaus thought about Heinrich studying medicine, about Wolfgang staying in Canada, about all the men who had learned hard lessons from kind guards and endless forest. The war had made them enemies. The peace, this strange, difficult peace, had reminded them they were human first. Going home meant teaching that lesson to a broken nation that desperately needed to remember it. The wilderness had taught them that land exists beyond flags, that forests grow regardless of which side wins, that mercy is not weakness, but the hardest form of courage. Now came the real work, building a world where the next generation wouldn't need to learn those lessons in prison camps. Klaus wrote until the sun set, and when he finally looked up, Canada had vanished behind them. But what it had taught them remained, carved deeper than any wooden bird, permanent as forest roots, impossible to forget.